I'm 24 years old right now, but this whole saga for me started at the age of 12 when I got an iPad for my 12th birthday. Classic story. And but really what happened, I guess, at the age of 12 is that I was starting to notice a lot of weird things going on in my life. There was one day in class when we were taking a stack of papers and passing it down, and my hand briefly brushed by the hand of one of my female classmates. And suddenly, I felt all of these odd sensations in my body that I had never felt before. For instance, my heart rate skyrocketed. I became really sweaty, but at the same time, my mouth was super dry. I felt kind of dizzy, and when I opened my mouth to try to apologize to this girl for for briefly touching her hand, I opened my mouth and no words came out. So I sort of lost the ability within an instant to form a coherent sentence, which I really didn't like because I was quite a talker as a kid. I was like a mini professor. So that happened. And at some point, I had realized that there was a correlation between me hanging around girls and me feeling all of these odd sensations in my body. Um, so I started hanging out with an all male peer group. Another thing I think that's important to add about this time is that I did not know what a crush was at this age when I was 12. I thought that Crush was a brand of orange soda, which for international listeners is kind of like Fanta. And I just thought that this Crush soda was, one of the trends that my peer group was obsessed with, similarly to silly bands, kendamas, and penny boards. But unlike all of those trends, which sort of were replaced by new ones eventually, this Crush obsession just kept raging. So I didn't know that the feelings that I was feeling were signs of a crush. I had no clue what they were. So like the good little researcher that I was, I went on the internet, I typed them into WebMD. And if there's anything you know about typing your symptoms into WebMD, whether they are like normal body aches and pains or anything else, WebMD will tell you that you're probably going to die. So I thought that I might have had, at least one of three neurodegenerative conditions based on what the WebMD search results presented me. So I thought that I was dying of some kind of disease. But I did realize that hanging around boys did not make me feel awkward in the way that hanging around girls did. So I hung out with the boys, and we basically made like a strategy to get the attention of the girls, where we basically became like a gang of pranksters and started pranking the teachers because it made the girls laugh. And none of us discussed this, but that's exactly what we were doing. And while I was hanging around in this male peer group, I really, I wanted to be like them, because that was my peer group. And that's sort of what kids at that age do. They develop a sort of a desire to dress themselves. You can't just stick a 12-year-old in whatever you want them to wear, because they're at that age where they want to develop their own style. And I'd seen, clips of the Ellen DeGeneres show, and I thought she was super well dressed. I really wanted to wear the type of dapper clothes that she was wearing, but I also wanted to wear the types of clothes that my male peers were wearing. And I quickly learned from the adults in my life that that was unacceptable and even disgusting behavior, in their words. So I had all of these things going on in my life, and I didn't know how to make sense of them. But because I grew up in a progressive American city, I was already aware of the concept of a sex change. However, the people who underwent sex changes were men who wanted to live as women. And a thought came into my mind, really a question, which is, could I as a girl do the same thing? Can a girl become a boy? So, like the good little researcher that I was, I typed it into Google and I got my answer. So that's really how it started.
Okay. Yeah, what was your relationship like with your parents at the time? How did they react when you told them that you thought you were a boy?
Oh, well, they were non-affirming. And this is back in 2012 when when very few people were aware of the concept of a quote unquote transgender child. Very few people would have known about this, aside from the parents who were transitioning their kids, and aside from people who had seen the Barbara Walters special with Jazz Jennings. So nobody knew, like, this was totally uncharted territory. And my parents were definitely freaked out by it. The conversation was handled in such a disastrous way that I realized, okay, I can't tell my parents anything anymore. So I just kind of was stuck with these feelings and stuck feeling totally alone, because back in 2012, the peer to peer social contagion within my age group had not started yet. It would start maybe 2 to 3 years later, even within more progressive cities. So I thought that I was going to grow up and be the only one who was dealing with this, set of feelings. So I was, yeah, I was alone and desperate and scared, and I didn't have anybody to talk to about these feelings, because I was worried really that it would get back to my parents if I did express any of these feelings to anybody else. And the fact that I had to suppress these feelings really, I guess, made the fantasy of transition just so much more enticing. So even though my parents didn't affirm me, the idea stuck around for the next 12 years of my life.
Yeah. Yeah, I can relate to that, because it was 2012 when I got sucked into all this as well. But I was 16, but it was just such a different world than it is now. It was pretty underground. And I just remember feeling like I was the only one, and that was a real wake up call when almost a decade later I realized that I wasn't the only one who had fallen for this. And something that I've picked up from your Twitter and from other interviews that you've done that I've watched is that you wound up in Israel, and I just found that part of your story so fascinating. You're talking about living in a very conservative culture. So I'm curious how you ended up in Israel.
Yeah, for sure. So once my parents realized that the trans fantasy was not going away with time, they basically made some stipulations saying that, if you want us to continue to help financially supporting you through college, which in the United States is incredibly expensive, you won't medicalize. And I mean, there was like a list of stipulations, but among them were no medicalization, and you have to do a year's study abroad in a country that doesn't support all of this stuff. And actually, previously, I had been to Israel on an 11-day trip to study the Israeli Palestinian conflict. And I really fell in love with the country. I grew up speaking English and Russian because one of my parents is from the former Soviet Union, and I'd started studying Arabic when I was 12. So I immediately took a liking to Israel for that reason. And I later learned Hebrew, so I spoke the 4 most commonly spoken languages in Israel. So I felt like I was really able to access the fullness and the diversity of that society. But what really made me want to study abroad in Israel was during this initial 11-day trip to study the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It was really when I was with my girlfriend at the time, and we'd broken off from our group because our sessions had finished, and we did a little bit of touring around the West Bank with our massive suitcases. We took a shared taxi from one city to the next, and we got off in the wrong city. So we were wandering around the West Bank with our suitcases, looking for anybody who could possibly give us some directions. And we'd stumbled into this coffee shop where we'd met the owner, who actually had some family that lived in the United States. And he was just really excited to have tourists because they probably didn't get a ton of tourists in that area. So he invited us in, he gave us some free hot dogs and free coffee, welcomed us in. We had a conversation. And somewhere along the line, my girlfriend and I had realized that sitting around us in this cafe were only men. And that's because in most Arab cities, like, Arab culture is overwhelmingly homosocial, meaning, sex segregated. So I knew that, that tourists can kind of get away with things that locals can't necessarily. And I had told this coffee shop owner that I actually spoke some Arabic. So we started chatting in Arabic, and he referred to me in the masculine. And that's the moment in which I realized, wow, while my presentation in the United States gets me read as a masculine woman, and that's unfavorable, here I can just blend into society doing the same exact thing, but people will perceive me to be a male. And then at that moment, I realized that actually it was my girlfriend who was the exception to the sort of unwritten social rule of, the sex segregated coffee shop. So that's the moment really in which I realized that I could use this whole situation to my advantage. My parents wanted me to go abroad so that I wouldn't transition. And I thought, well, I can actually use this to my advantage because in this society, outside of Tel Aviv, basically nobody knows what a masculine lesbian is. So it's going to be really, really easy for me to live the life that I've always wanted to. So then I started my year study abroad, and I loved it so much that I decided that I wanted to stay and become an Israeli citizen. And this process took many years because the bureaucracy did not know whether to process my case as an American case or as a former Soviet case. So I was bounced between like 5 different bureaucratic institutions, and this took several years in which I was illegal. So I couldn't access any kind of healthcare, or well, if I did, it would have to be private. So I didn't have healthcare access really, and I didn't have a worker's visa. So really, I couldn't medicalize at this time. Although that was the goal, and I was really trying to push along the citizenship process so that I could get closer and closer to the goal of transition. But while I was illegal, I was having all kinds of really interesting, super rich, kind of crazy life experiences where everybody around me knew me as a guy, and very, very few people knew that I was actually female. And including some of my Palestinian friends didn't even know that I was Jewish. So I was living layers of a double life, and I was doing peace events in the West Bank with Jews and Arabs. And then when I was in Israel proper during the work week, I was actually working as like a house cleaner and caterer within the ultra Orthodox Jewish sector of the society, where I basically was like cosplaying as an ultra Orthodox Jewish guy. Like I wore the whole getup, the black pants, white shirt, the ritual fringes, and the yarmulke, of course. So I was living my life in that way and seamlessly blending in both within Palestinian society and within Orthodox Jewish society, as well as the broader secular Israeli society. So that's sort of what I was doing around that time.
So it sounds like both cultures are so strictly homosocial that it was actually very easy for you to kind of slip out of one sex category socially, and despite your parents thinking, oh, this will be a break away from it all for her. That's interesting. I feel like I've read quite a few parent accounts of moving to a more rural area, maybe to a country, a completely different country, to kind of get their children out of it. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. In your case, you were able to use it to your advantage to pursue what you were into at the time.
Yes. Yeah. This happened on my first visit to Israel, where after my girlfriend and I had gotten back from the West Bank, we went into Jerusalem to visit some friends of hers, and we went to pray at the Western Wall, which has a men's section and a women's section. And my girlfriend and the other girl who was with us, they went to the women's section, and I always carried a yarmulke in my pocket, put it on my head, strolled right into the men's section of the Western Wall. And I'm greeted by this 18-year-old kid from New York. And he asks me, "Excuse me, sir, are you Jewish?" And I told him that I was. And he asked me, "Are you above the age of 13? And I thought, ouch, because I was 19, but I told him yes. And he asked me if I'd wrap tefillin that day. And tefillin, it's basically those black straps that you'll sometimes see maybe in pictures, or if you've ever come across Orthodox Jewish men praying, they wrap these ritual straps made from a kosher animal, which are connected to boxes that contain Torah scrolls on the inside of them. One box goes on the arm to represent the Torah, going in through your veins, and one of them goes on the head to represent the Torah going into your brain. So it's a ritual, and men will wrap these most days of the week and say a prayer. And this is a really important Jewish ritual. And so upon finding out that I was Jewish, this 18-year-old kid from New York he asked me, so have you ever wrapped this to fill in before? Like, have you wrapped it today? And I said, actually, I've never wrapped it in my life. And he said, like, not even at your bar mitzvah. And I said, oh no, I didn't have a bar mitzvah. So this kid gets super excited because he can be the Jew that assists another Jew in this important ritual. So we do the ritual. Next thing I know, he calls to some of his friends in Yiddish. Then me and like this group of 6 or 7 Orthodox Jewish guys are holding hands, dancing around in a circle, singing songs. And then we hear a siren, the Shabbat siren, which was basically there to indicate to everybody that it's time to wrap up and go home to celebrate the Sabbath with their families. And because phones are prohibited on Shabbat, on the Sabbath, this kid who had really run me through this ritual asks me for my phone. He wants, at first I thought he wanted to make a phone call maybe, but he asked me to open up the camera, and I had to, he wanted to take a picture, and I had to teach him to press on the big white button to take the picture, because this kid had clearly never seen a smartphone in his life or never used one. And he tells me to stand in front of the wall, and I ask him, so hey, like, where do you want me to stand? And he says, well, where would you like me to take your bar mitzvah photo? So that's the moment in which I realized that I had just experienced the bar mitzvah and I didn't know it happened until it was over. And that was a really, I guess, important coming of age experience for me, that not only reified my Jewish identity, which I was in the process of reconnecting to, because I come from a former Soviet background where religion was illegal. And so any cultural rituals that go alongside the religious ones also, were lost consequently. So not only did it help me in my sort of identity quest of reconnecting to my Jewish roots, but it also further reified my male identity.
Oh, I'm curious how you managed to find your way out of this.
Yeah, so the desistance process took several years. It was incredibly long. And I never expected that I would ever be able to find peace in my body without transition, because I had got into this idea, I'd gotten this into my head so young, and I really believed that this was my way out of the distress, and that this was really the way that I would be able to, get girls and become successful. I really genuinely believed the idea that being a very masculine woman, not just in behavior, but also in dress, was disgusting, and that nobody would love me in that way. And so I thought that either I had to be a really girly girl, which I tried it out. I was super uncomfortable, most depressed period in my life. That, made things a lot easier at home, but it made things a lot harder for me emotionally and internally. So I thought either I have to do that, or I have to transition and appear as a man, because otherwise who's going to love me? So this is really what drove me in my transition. But as far as desistance goes, my process of desistance, really, I would say the first seed of doubt that I actually followed, that I didn't just bury away in the depths of my mind, really started during the first war that I experienced in Israel, which was in May of 2021. So I would say that my desistance process actually started in a bomb shelter. I was with a different girl that I was dating at the time, and we were actually going to go out to a show. And we just kept delaying leaving the house, kept getting distracted. And right as we were about to leave, we heard a siren, and my body started shaking. I was terrified, because it wasn't the type of siren that I'd heard before. And I look at my girlfriend, who had lived in Israel slightly longer than I had, and I asked her, I was like, what's going on? And she's like, they're launching rockets at us. And then I say, like, what are we supposed to do? And then she says, we need to go to a bomb shelter now. And I ask her, okay, where's the bomb shelter? She's like, I don't know, I'm new to this apartment. So the first few sirens, we just go down to the lowest level of the apartment, because you're less likely to be hit by a rocket on the lower levels. But eventually we looked it up online. We found where the bomb shelter was. So with each siren, we had 2 cats that we had to pack up, and we had to run in order to make it there in time. And there were a couple times that we missed the bomb shelter. We couldn't get there in time. So we'd hid under a tree, and I had seen like 3 rockets going past me over my head, like one after the other, ripping through the air. It was an absolutely just existentially terrifying experience. And bomb shelters are really depressing places to be in because there's no Wi-Fi, so you can't distract yourself from yeah, like there's no way to distract yourself from the scariest experience in your life. You just have to sit there and listen as the rockets rip through the air, and as they're intercepted by the Iron Dome, it creates a massive like sound of an explosion that shakes the foundation of any building you're in, including a bomb shelter. So it's really terrifying stuff. And when I wasn't in the bomb shelter, and my girlfriend and I had made it back to the apartment, I made the mistake of opening Instagram, and I basically saw that my leftist American friends were essentially justifying why Israelis had to live under rocket fire. So that was shocking to me. But I, as a kid, well, not as a kid, as a young adult, I actually also used to be a pro-Palestinian campus activist as a Jew. I wasn't one of these rabid ones, but I certainly, having studied Arabic since I was 12, I really developed a certain fondness for certain aspects of Arabic culture. So it was natural that, I would go with that peer group because I wasn't connected to my Jewish roots. So, and I do believe that Arabs and Jews have a lot in common. So I was hanging out with the Arabs, and that's what they did. They did the pro-Palestinian activism, and so did I. And it was actually this initial trip to Israel which made me realize that I was being lied to by the Western left, and what made me, shift my worldview. And so when I saw my leftist American friends who I had known from high school debate tournaments, people who I trusted, whose logical reasoning I'd trusted, I just thought, okay, well, they don't have all the information here. They don't realize that the Palestinian resistance that they are advocating for is done by a terrorist group that not only wants to eliminate all Jews out of the region and off the face of the planet, but is willing to and actively encourages the killing of as many Palestinians as they possibly can in order to do that. And I just thought, well, they don't have this information, just like I didn't have this information. And if I give them, reputable sources, and if I construct my arguments in a persuasive way, they will just be able to include that information within their logical calculus and realize that there's another side to this story that they're just not getting. So I'd made a series of Instagram posts, and I was not able to achieve the desired outcome. These leftist American friends just became much more angry with me. They called me a colonizer and a settler sympathizer. A lot of them blocked me. And so that's the moment where I guess 2 major things happened. The first is that I realized that even the most intelligent, educated people within my peer group on the left were not willing to entertain any kind of evidence in order to develop a more sort of comprehensive understanding of one of the world's most intractable conflicts. They're not willing to do that. So that was one thing that happened. But the second thing that happened is really, I think a lot of parents will relate to me on this, is the fact that we know that internet algorithms are incredibly powerful. So in the process of trying to provide these American friends of mine with better evidence that corresponded to, the fact that they're not getting the whole story, the pro-Israel position was, especially because the newest iteration of the culture wars were raging in the United States at that time, the pro-Israel position was associated with other, positions in the basket of acceptable ideas on the right wing. So having searched for sources to debate my friends in this way, the algorithm had started to suggest me more content that was aligned with the right wing side of the emerging culture wars. And so I started to be exposed to the ways in which gender ideology had started to really infiltrate Western society, and the absurdities of it. And this was shocking to me because I was never really affiliated with the trans community. I really had nothing in common with them because I had been trans identified for years before my peer group caught on. And most of my peer group started to go with non-binary, which I already like automatically recognized as not what, like nothing that represented me, nothing that I wanted to do. I just wanted to assimilate into society, you know, as a man, but they wanted to break down all the norms. So I already, you know, didn't find any kind of affinity with the trans community. And even in university, instead of hanging out with the trans identified people, I just hung out with the Arabs. And then I went to Israel and I just lived my life as a guy. So I didn't realize, you know, the extent to which everything had gone off the rails, but I was exposed to the fact that men were competing in women's sports, to, you know, all the drag queen story hours, all of the more sort of pop culture elements of the right-wing culture wars. And I started to go down the rabbit hole and getting suggested more and more content in regards to this. And eventually I had stumbled across, you know, the first story that I had seen of a detransitioner. And that was the moment in which I realized that it actually was possible to regret transition, because previously I had heard, you know, when I found this concept in medical journals, everybody was talking about the fact that regret rates were super low. But, you know, we know that there's a certain power to human stories in persuasion. At least I've realized that human stories are uniquely persuasive. And I was really curious about what this young detransitioned woman had to say. So I clicked on the video, I listened to it, and I thought, well, there's no way this is going to be me, because this woman was, you know, very feminine. And I thought, well, yeah, I mean, of course, the feminine straight girls are going to regret their transition. And when I'd seen that cohort of you know, feminine heterosexual women transitioning, even when I was, you know, firmly trans identified, I thought, you know, this is a bad idea. They're going to regret this. I don't know why they're doing this. So that further reified, you know, my idea that I was a true transsexual. So I stayed in the true trans camp for several years and realized that the arguments provided by the true trans camp were really like internally logically inconsistent, to the point where basically the arguments from one proponent of this ideology to the next were basically moving targets. So once I realized that that ideology didn't make any sense, I started to realize that the entire idea of undergoing, you know, dangerous and experimental medical interventions with, you know, that they're not underpinned by any kind of evidence base. What is purported to be the evidence base is incredibly weak, so shaky to the fact that within other fields of medicine, we would have long come to the conclusion that this is not an evidence base to underpin doing these types of experimental treatments outside of experimental trials and outside of experimental protocols. So I realized that a lot of things were going wrong. But actually, even that didn't cause me to desist. It just made me think, okay, well, I'm just going to delay the transition a few years and hope that, you know, maybe the evidence base improves, or, you know, who knows.
What year was this?
So this whole process of desistance, I mean, when I got exposed to the first, you know, gender critical ideas, might have been in 2021, but I didn't truly desist until very recently. And actually, like, I think that, you know, so I had ended up at some point at one of these Gen Spec conferences, and I'd met detransitioned women, including one who was a butch lesbian. And that's the moment in which I realized, oh, somebody who's very much like me can go through this process and still regret it. So, but even that, you know, I came back to Israel from that conference and I still went on living my life as a man, because although I had all of these doubts and all these questions, like, I didn't know how to unravel myself from all of those social relationships where I'd, you know, intertwined myself within these two, you know, very conservative societies. I just really didn't know how I was going to get myself out of that situation. And it didn't seem to actually be safe or in my best interest to do so. But another key moment in my desistance process actually was October 7th. So, you know, on October 6th, I I was doing a peace event between Jewish and Arab children in a Bedouin village, and I'd done some of these types of events before. And it was so optimistic because the kids, they didn't speak each other's languages, but after just a few hours of playing with each other, they'd picked up a few words of Hebrew or Arabic or English or Russian or French, whatever the kids were speaking. You know, their brains are like sponges, and it was so optimistic. You know, you're in a village, and you're in the feeling of the village itself. You feel like you're a part of that village. And really, it was the nearest adult who would help a child, you know, if they fell down and hurt themselves. And it didn't matter if they were from the same religion or ethnic group, or even if they spoke the same language. And I was so hopeful that, like, if we all just invest in the process of peace on the ground, you know, we can't control our corrupt politicians or the terrorist groups in the region who really try to, you know, sink us into endless wars, but we can control the way we educate our kids. And I was so hopeful about it. And then October 7th happened. And I was actually supposed to be at one of the festivals that was invaded by Hamas. But a few days before that point, my sober driver had fallen through. And that's the reason why, instead of being at that festival, I was doing the peace event with the kids. So a few hours after I'd had this amazing experience with the kids, I'd gone back to where I was living, and I woke up to a siren at 8 in the morning. And we don't often get sirens in the area that I was living in. So I was shocked, and I opened my phone and I saw a video of my friend being executed by terrorists who were live streaming it. And so my life had changed, and I didn't have a chance to process that grief or anything because the sirens were nonstop. And I hadn't had a chance to put my binder on at that time. I just had to run. So for the first time in my life, I had to feel the way that my body moved naturally, not being constricted by this binder. And it was, of course, incredibly uncomfortable, not just emotionally, but I mean, screw emotionally. Physically, it was very uncomfortable. And I was scared, and I just needed to run as fast as I could to the bomb shelter. But the process of having to do that so many times made me realize, you know, that my body is actually much more capable than I thought it was previously. Like, that experience of not having time to put on the binder, really because of the frequency of these sirens, is really what made me sort of snap back into my body and snap back into reality. But in the previous wars, I had already thought about, like, you know, at one point it occurred to me, like, in the bomb shelter, what would happen if right now I were in a hospital recovering from top surgery, which is the euphemism used to describe a radical elective double mastectomy. I just thought, what if I were right now in the hospital recovering from top surgery, and I couldn't move my hands above my shoulders, and if I hear a siren, I can't run? Like, what the hell is going to happen to me? So that thought occurred to me. And also, whenever any of these wars started, and I lived through 3 of them, whenever any of these wars start, you can never tell exactly how long they'll last. And you certainly can't predict when they'll start. It's not like you can take, you know, you can take time off of work to recover from one of these surgeries. But what you can't do is say, I'm going to schedule a war to happen so that I can recover enough from my mastectomy to the point where I can save myself if a siren comes. Like, it's all extremely impractical. And these wars, you never know how long they're going to last. And as we're seeing right now, this war within the Middle East is lasting much longer than was expected. And there's no way that doesn't impact supply chains. And I'd already known, because I'd been researching these medical interventions for such a long time, that if a woman takes testosterone for a prolonged period of time, this actually puts her reproductive system at risk of extreme atrophy, which in some cases can go septic and become deadly. And if you need to have your reproductive system removed, your body can no longer produce its own hormones. And now I know that, you know, if there's anything more dangerous than having copious amounts of cross-sex hormones flooding your body, it's actually having absolutely no sex hormones in your body. And I realized that war makes it impractical to rely on pharmaceutical companies when your bone health and your brain health, that is associated with having some kind of sex hormone within your body. Like, I realized that I can't depend on pharmaceutical companies and supply chains to sustain me in this way through the process of war. I realized that actually transitioning is not an option that I was going to take. Not in 3 years, not in 5 years, not ever. I had just contemplated too much about the risk to myself and my health. And that's the moment in which I really, in a way, sort of buried that fantasy. And I guess somewhat of a proverbial grave. And it did feel very much like mourning, because this is the goal that I had had for half of my life. And I'd built my entire sense of self on the false premise that my female body, existing in its healthy and natural state, was actually a pathology that needed to and could be fixed with experimental and dangerous interventions from the moment that I became financially independent from my parents. And I really didn't know how to envision a future outside of transition. And so I'd put all of this distress that I'd accumulated over the years about my body and about my sexual orientation and all of these insecurities, I had basically put them in a time capsule and sort of, I guess, petrified them with or preserved them within the period of time in which they happened. And rather than overcoming, for example, the distress that I had around my breasts, when I started to have that distress, rather than being able to, from a developmental perspective, get over that as I got older, instead I just thought, well, I know I don't need to deal with this because someday I will have my breasts removed. So now I'm contending with half a lifetime worth of distress that is coming out in the most overwhelming and distressing overall time of my life, with living through war and dealing with the aftermath, the psychological aftermath of what I've seen and the people I've lost. So I mean, I think it's a misnomer to say that just because somebody has desisted from a trans identity and not incurred the medical harm in relation to cross-sex hormones and these surgeries, that somehow they're coming out of this experience unscathed.
It seems like living through war, and I realize that our listeners have a variety of perspectives on this, pro-Palestinian, pro-Israeli, somewhere in the middle. Living through a war just has to put things in perspective. The gender cult talks about misgendering is literal violence. You have bombs going overhead. That's got to put your previous worries into perspective. When you were dating women, were the two of you thinking of it as a heterosexual relationship, or was there an understanding that it was a lesbian relationship but you were uncomfortable being seen as a woman, or what was that like?
So obviously with an intimate partner, there's really no way of denying the reality of your biological sex.
Yeah.
I only very recently within my life started to refer to myself as a lesbian. But I knew that I wasn't literally a man, and I knew that it wasn't a heterosexual relationship. And whenever somebody would try to imply that, I mean, it would make me kind of viscerally kind of uncomfortable, because I just knew that it wasn't a heterosexual relationship. That was very obvious. I probably would have called it a homosexual relationship, but I would not have called it a lesbian relationship per se, because that word had just been so villainized from when I was a young age, that's really the last thing that I wanted to be was a lesbian.
Mm-hmm.
So shortly after October 7th, I moved back to the States. Which was also kind of earth shattering, because I really wanted to be with, my fellow Israelis, and that includes Jews and Arabs, who we were all, because we were in this peace community, and those are the people that I really wanted to be with. But people in my life were just getting really spooked by it, and I was also spooked because I was supposed to be at that festival, and I didn't know like how much luck do I have, before my luck runs out. So about a week after October 7th, I found myself back in the United States. And I would say that the process of, reintegrating with my body and with society as a woman is different in this type of an environment than it would be over there. Like when I go back to Israel at some point, I would probably just have to move to a different city where nobody knows me, because in the city I was living in, basically everybody knew me because of the languages I spoke. So, as far as reintegrating with my my biological identity, I'm going to say that it's still an ongoing process because desistance is so recent for me. But I did write a book based on my life with an Israeli social worker who is the only professional in the entire country of Israel who is speaking out against the harm of this ideology, both like for children, for women, and for gay people. And she's the only professional in Israel who's speaking out about this with her name and face attached to it. So we've been working on a series of children's books that is available in a bunch of different languages. And I wrote a story based on my life. And in the process of writing this story, I really had to, for the first time, contemplate, I had to come up with a coherent narrative to try to understand what happened to me and, how it is that I got sucked into something, which despite the fact that, theoretically there could have been an off ramp at any point because I wasn't being affirmed by the people who mattered most to me at the time, which were my parents. The fact that I still got sucked into it, like there was a lot to explore there. And I had to actually contend with the emotional distress because while I was transitioning, I thought of it as being a very practical decision. Of course, until war made me realize just how impractical, this actually was. But basically, I had to try to rationalize my experience in a more emotional way. I had to pair the emotional aspect with the rational aspect, and I'm very good with logical argumentation and rationalizations, but what I'm really not good at is identifying and understanding my own emotions. So yeah, like I had to, in the process of writing this book, I realized that actually, a lot of things were going on in my life, and that helped me to develop a more, I guess, compassionate understanding of myself and where I was at different points in my life. And I realized also that actually, like I realized that I actually want to speak out about my story because when I was contemplating whether or not I should give up on my dream of transition, I didn't see a single detrans story that spoke to me because there were no young butch lesbians speaking out. And really the right wing, who is the champion of this issue, needs to toe the party line and therefore is very unlikely to talk about the harms to gay people. And the left, who purportedly cares about gay people, or at least did in the past, doesn't want to touch this issue, which is harming gay people, massively. And so nobody wants to cover it. And I thought, well, I need to speak out in hopes of maybe a young woman seeing my story. Or so in the process of speaking out, like speaking to somebody like you or going on the other podcasts I've been on, each time I talk with somebody, I realize like I sort of synthesize another aspect of my story and I come to new realizations. So that's also helping. But I'd say that, meeting other detransitioners in real life who have become some of my best friends because we have a shared experience that really very few other people do, has also really helped me to sort of make sense of my experience. Really, what allowed me to like give myself the permission to try to be comfortable as a woman was the realization, the simple tagline that a woman is an adult human female, not a feminine adult human female.
Yeah. Yeah, that's literally exactly what it was for me. It's just adult human female. There's no conditions. Is that book published yet?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Yeah, I can put a link to it down in the description.
Yeah, absolutely.
Who is the professional who's speaking out?
Oh, her name is Tal Croetoro.
I think I'm friends with her on Facebook.
Yeah, wow. Well,
Yeah, small
yeah.
world. Okay, yeah, no. If we can jump topics, what is your relationship with your parents like these days? I mean, do they accept you as a lesbian? As
I would say that they see it as not ideal,
okay,
but better than medicalizing. Like, I think the fact that the threat of medicalization sort of made them rethink the type of pushback they were giving me about my gender nonconformity as a kid. And it was very, very intense pushback that made me feel a lot of shame. And I think that, because we're on the same page now about this gender stuff, we can bond over that, at least like intellectually. But as far as sort of lesbian identity or being a butch lesbian, yeah, like it's not ideal. I think, it's very scary, especially with the background from the former Soviet Union and like the the extreme dislike of that society for nonconformity, especially because we come from a Jewish, Soviet background. Um, Being a Jew already, that was written on all your documents. And Jews could never be number one, no matter how much more qualified they were than any other people in the running for the same position. They could only strive to be number two. So being some other minority on top of being a Jew, I mean, that would have been social death. That would have been an absolute catastrophe. And so I think that mindset, that certain like fear of something really bad happening to your kid because of the ways in which they're very non-conforming, I think that like that is sort of what motivated the less than supportive, parental attitudes within my home. And so like I think that especially from this sort of former Soviet, post-Soviet Jewish background, I think that that's where those attitudes came from. And I think that, with time, uh, they'll be able to sort of cope better with the fact that I will end up with a woman, that I am a lesbian. And I think that, I mean, they're at the very least extremely grateful for the fact that I haven't medicalized. So that's sort of how that's going. I've found that the easiest way to desist is to do it in a community where other people understand what I'm going through and can sort of help me. Um, and I've been speaking out. I found it to be healing and to be like on multiple levels, not just cathartic, but also in the relationships that I've been able to build with this network of like detransitioners and with different parents and different therapists and adults and real academic thinkers, who I've been able to sort of you know shoot some shots with my ideas, and we just discuss a variety of very interesting topics whenever I go to one of these conferences or whenever I speak out at some place. And I guess the plans for me so far are basically to continue research I'm doing about a variety of topics, in the gender space, and also bridging like the cross-cultural perspective, like that I'm working on now. I'm working on a paper right now that basically compares the two internet cults of the 2010s, and both one of them being obviously trans, as we're talking about, and the other one being actually how like ISIS recruited Western youngsters to join. And there are so many parallels, not just the fact that they're cults, but the ways in which these two internet cults of the 2010s functioned to recruit young people. Like both of these cults have like subverted Western society. It just seems like every country is taking it like one step at a time. Like, these European countries will repatriate the foreign fighters that joined ISIS, and these won't. And there's no unified strategy to come together to handle this problem. And so now it's just becoming a massive threat that we are putting off with each and every day, saying this is a tomorrow problem, when it's going to be a massive problem from the moment that, these radicalized terrorists break out of the camps that they're confined within. And similarly, the way in which I'm comparing it to this ideological capture with trans ideology is that, like, this is a fundamentally international phenomenon. Treatment started in the Netherlands. The ideology spread, it started in the United States and spread globally. And the both these treatments and the guidelines around them are inherently international. Like anybody who's been within the trans community knows not only about what is happening within the trans community in the United States, but they also know about the quote unquote anti-trans legislation that is happening in other countries. And they're using this as in a way to sort of undermine, it's no longer about like a civil rights movement that is contained within their own country. It is a movement which aims to basically demolish all of the borders, all of the national sovereign borders, in which they have their own flag and they have their own transnational community. And people are giving, like, some trans identified people are giving other trans identified people, like, they're shipping hormones to one another. They are sending these bad ideas all over the world and radicalizing kids all over the world. So both of these phenomena have some key elements of similarity. And I worry that, I guess to answer your question of, what's in my future, I really want to start talking about, like, I really want to start having people think about, like, what does the day after look like? Like, once we ban all of these treatments for minors, and once we hopefully severely restrict them for young adults, as there is absolutely no evidence base to underpin these interventions. Once we do that, but you have all of these kids who are distressed coming in, and they were indoctrinated from a young age, thinking, understanding themselves to be people who are born in the wrong body, and being told from a very young age that there is a suicide risk if they don't receive these interventions. Like, you have all these kids who have these really dangerous ideas, who've been sold a lie in their most formative developmental years. And then once these treatments aren't allowed for those kids anymore, like, our society is going to have like a massive risk that it's going to have to overcome with the mental health fragility of these kids. So I would love to just continue writing and, to continue speaking out and to give people insight about my own experience and about, like, what I've realized from living in the Middle East, just basically, doing what I'm doing now, and just hoping that my experiences and my insight can help somebody understand themselves or the cultural context in which their child is becoming trans identified in a more clear way, in a less sort of emotionally charged way. Because, I really don't want parents to blame themselves. I think that, the odds are stacked against them. And I say that not in a way to make them feel hopeless, but in a way to realize that, like, you could have done everything right and your kids still could have gotten sucked into this, but there are ways to get your kids out. And I have a lot of insight that can help potentially. And I'm glad also to direct parents to more professional resources who have this type of experience. So yeah, I mean, essentially, like, my last concluding point is that a lot of people, when they're asked, like, why do you want to get into activism? And it's not just about trans or like anti-gender ideology activism. A lot of people will say, I want to just, like, I would be happy if my story can just save one person. But I don't want my story to just save one person. I want to impact as many people as I humanly can. And I want, as many young women, especially young lesbians, because I don't see other young lesbians speaking out. Like, I want my voice to serve as the voice of young lesbians, to help other young women in my position to sort of recognize that what's happening to them is not okay, and that there is another way for them to rationalize their experience in a way that they can actually come to peace with, instead of constantly being at war with their own bodies. And so I really just, I hope that my story gets out there to as many people as will listen and learn from it. And I really just appreciate, the platform that you've given me to be able to discuss these ideas, and also for the points that you've brought up throughout this interview. I mean, I really appreciate this. I just thank you so much.
You're welcome. Yeah, and I think, I mean, I wish you the best of luck in this. I think you have a really unique story, and one thing that I've just been struck by is that still pretty freshly out of this ideology, and just consistently from interviews and from your Twitter and whatnot, you just have a very clear understanding of all that you've been through at an age when, a lot of young women are still stuck in this cult. So I think you have a very important story to tell.
I think it's really powerful also when detransitioners come together physically, and they speak at, they speak at events, at conferences, at panels, at conventions. I think there's something uniquely powerful about that, because we share ideas. And like, I think that, if there are any parents who have some resources and are willing to sort of, pull some resources together to help get detransitioners together, to speak, really. And there are a lot of parents who are doing that already, but just like anybody who has resources, I think, and who has a kid that's wrapped up in this, I think that a really good investment, you know outside of what you're investing in your child, if you have any energy or like financial resources that are left over from that, and you feel like investing it somewhere, maybe the best investment would be actually to invest in detransitioners who want to tell their stories, and who have all kinds of like advice and insight. I think that the caucus that you've created is really just like absolutely invaluable. This is like the efforts, like the effort you're putting it through is precisely the type of thing I'm describing. Frankly, like I think that what you're doing is really important. And like we just need to, yeah, like connect to sisters and detransitioners. And because there are so many different paths to healing, and ultimately community is probably the most salient and impactful one of these.